Hi there, friends. This is Robert Hatton. This is The Encourager. This morning I've got a question for you. And my question is, who wrote Mark's Gospel? Today, scholars would question the authorship of Mark's Gospel. For many, many years, we believed it was Mark. I still believe it was Mark who wrote this Gospel. It doesn't say that in the Gospel, but we know from the tradition, from things that had been passed down, that it was Mark. Even in the second century, we have quotations from various people who confirmed that Mark wrote this Gospel. But Mark was a very common name in those days. So there were many people who were called Mark. So which Mark are we talking about? And we believe that we find this guy in a few places in the Bible. First of all, the British Bible teacher David Pawson, he believes that we meet the father of Mark towards the end of Mark's Gospel. And Jesus sends his disciples to Jerusalem to go and find the room that he's already prepared, where they are going to celebrate the feast of the Passover. And they find a man who's carrying a jar of water. And Pawson believes that this is Mark's father. Then Mark's parents, they had quite a large house in Jerusalem. They had servants. There's a girl called Rhoda who you read about later. So they were quite well off. And it could be true that this Passover festival that Jesus and his disciples celebrated was indeed in the house of Mark and his parents. After the crucifixion, the disciples hid themselves away, probably in the same room, and there wasn't just the 12 disciples or 11 disciples. Judas had already gone. There were a few other people. There were some women, but there were also other people there as well. And of course, when we come to the day of Pentecost, there are 120 people gathered in that room, in that house. So it must have been quite a big house. Later, in chapter 3 of the Acts of the Apostles, Peter and John are arrested. They spend a night in prison. On the next day, when they are released, they go to the house where the church is meeting, where the church is praying. And they have another prayer session together, which is very dramatic. And later, Peter and James are arrested. James is executed, and Peter is going to be executed after the festival. But an angel comes and releases him from prison. And Peter goes to the church that is meeting in the house of Barnabas' sister, Mary. Barnabas' sister, Miriam is a Hebrew word. And this Mary is the mother of Mark. Mark's parents gave him this name, Mark, which is actually a Latin name or a Roman name, and it shows the connection that they had to Roman culture. And later, when we get the Mark's Gospel, we don't see it because we are reading the English. But in the Greek text, there are a number of Latin words that Mark has not bothered to translate. His relatives and the people that he had to do with, we'll talk about Peter in a minute, they would speak Aramaic. So Mark, he was a Greek speaker, he was a Latin speaker, he would speak Hebrew and also probably Aramaic. Now his parents, they were somehow connected closely with Roman culture, but first and foremost, they were Jews and believing Jews. So their son, Mark, had a second name, and this second name was John, Yohannim in Hebrew. And John means God will show grace. And this is an important name for him. So the Mark who we're talking about is actually John Mark. Mark with the name John. So John Mark, we're talking about John Mark, and he lived with his parents in Jerusalem. But at one point he moved house and he moved to Antioch, probably when his uncle Barnabas moved house. The church in Jerusalem sent Barnabas to Antioch, and Barnabas went to Tarsus and collected Saul, and they became a team there. Then in chapter 13, they are sent out, first of all to Cyprus, and then they go to Asia Minor. Today, that's Turkey. And as they leave Antioch, John Mark comes to be with them, to serve them, to help them, and things go quite well in Cyprus. But on the way between Cyprus and Asia Minor, something happens. One of the things that happens is that Paul changes his name. He from Saul to Paul. That's the same as John Mark. Saul is a Hebrew name, and Paul is the Greek Roman name, and he'd been known by Paul ever since that. But also he takes on the leadership of this team, and maybe John Mark didn't like that. Maybe he felt that his uncle was being deported, and he left them. It must have been something quite serious that caused him to leave them, which showed that there was, he did something wrong, or there was a flaw in his character, or he was simply immature. But when they returned to Antioch, a few other things happened. And when they wanted to go on to the second missionary journey, Barnabas said he would go and get John Mark and he'd take him with him. And Paul didn't want John Mark to come with them, and they argued about that, and in the end this caused them to separate. John Mark was the cause of the separation of Barnabas and Paul. It's really a sad story. I guess John Mark he'd done something wrong. There was a flaw in his character. He was perhaps immature. I'm not sure what was happening, but they separated. But there was some reconciliation later. There was also a restoration of John Mark. And Paul writes in Colossians chapter 4, I think verse 10, he says, if Mark comes to you, then receive him wholeheartedly. And again in Timothy, second letter to Timothy, he said, please send John Mark to me, because he's a good fellow and I need him for my ministry. And also though, Peter writes about him, and he calls him Mark, my son. And there's a very close relationship later between Peter and Mark. So at some point, Peter goes to Rome, and John Mark is either already in Rome or he goes with Peter, because now we see that there's quite a close relationship between Peter and Mark. And in fact, the Gospel of Mark is really the Gospel of Peter. Mark wrote it down, but Peter was dictating it to Mark. Peter was an eyewitness of what had happened. Peter had been with Jesus, but he couldn't speak Greek, and he was speaking in Aramaic, and John was writing it down in Greek for him. And there are a few words that he found he couldn't translate. They were too difficult. He didn't have the word, so he just wrote them in Aramaic. And the same is in there are some words that he puts there in Latin. Our translators have nearly always just translated them into English for us. One or two exceptions. We think about the words on the cross where Jesus cries out in Aramaic, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. The people who are standing under the cross who speak Hebrew, they didn't understand what he was saying. It was Aramaic, and Mark does then translate it for us and tells us it's a prophetic psalm, Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? So Peter stood behind John and was dictating this, because Peter was an eyewitness. Now the two other so-called synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew and Luke, they use Mark as their outline, and it's a very similar structure to Mark. But Matthew, he tells us about the birth of Jesus, about the wise men coming from the east, about the star, and so on. He tells us some more things about after the resurrection that Mark doesn't mention. Luke tells us also about Christmas, the birth of Jesus, about them going from Nazareth to Bethlehem, about the shepherds seeing the angels and all this, and that's all missing from from Mark's gospel, but they used it as an outline. Now Matthew, he was one of Jesus' disciples. He was also an eyewitness. And if it was just Mark who was reading because his mother had told him something, he'd heard something from Paul, he'd heard something from this person, Matthew would never have used it as his outline, but he accredited authority to what Peter was writing. Now, I told you, John Mark, he did something. His character was flawed. He perhaps wasn't mature, and he was rejected by this great man of God. He was rejected by the Apostle Paul. What a terrible thing to happen. But perhaps maybe you have experienced something like this, that you've been rejected. You have realized you've done something wrong. You have realized that your character has been flawed and that you were immature. We were all immature at one time. But remember the second name, Mark's second name. It was John. And John means that God will show grace. And wherever you are today, you know what? God will show grace. There's grace for today. There's grace for this time. There's grace to overcome whatever you did wrong in the past. There's forgiveness. There's restoration. There is reconciliation. There is grace for the flaws in your character. There is grace for your immaturity. And so, dear friend, I want to encourage you not to give up, but to get a hold of this grace and expect reconciliation, expect restoration, expect that God has still got a plan for you. God bless you. Have a good day. Robert Hatton, your encourager.